The crystal flute in Eleanor Vance's hand felt as cold and empty as the cavernous ballroom around her. From the 40th floor of the Vance Tower, the city was a glittering tapestry of anonymous lights, a perfect reflection of her life. Spectacular from a distance, hollow up close. She was the CEO of Vance Innovations, a titan of the tech industry, and tonight, at her company's annual charity gala, she was the undisputed queen of a kingdom that brought her no joy. Then she saw him, Julian Croft, the ghost of her past, impeccably tailored and smiling a predator's smile as he moved through the crowd. He was the man who had been her partner, her fiancé, the man who had stolen her original code, her trust, and the first iteration of her company, leaving her with nothing but a thirst for revenge that had fueled her climb to the top. He was making a direct line for her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed armor. Julian thrived on weakness. He was here to gloat, to remind her of his latest acquisition, a company that directly threatened her market share. She couldn't face him alone. Not now. Not when the old wounds felt so raw. Her eyes darted around, searching for a shield, an escape, and then she saw them. Near a service entrance, a man with kind eyes and broad shoulders was quietly speaking to a little girl, his daughter by the look of it, who was clutching a small stuffed bear. He was dressed in the simple, professional black attire of the event's contracted artisans. He must have been one of the craftsmen who'd built the magnificent oak bar for the evening. He was calm. He was grounded. He was the antithesis of everything in this room. He was her only hope. Leaving a stunned board member mid-sentence, Eleanor moved with a speed that defied her couture gown. She reached the man just as Julian was 10 feet away. She didn't have time for pleasantries. "Please," she whispered, her voice tight with desperation. "I know this is insane, but I need you to do something for me. Be my husband for 5 minutes." The man, Marcus Thorne, looked down at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. He had been explaining to his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, why they had to wait a little longer before they could go home. He'd taken the gala job, installing the custom shelving behind the bar, the weight of the world on your shoulders. Eleanor forced a smile, the gesture feeling foreign on her lips. She leaned into Marcus's solid frame. "Julian, how lovely to see you crawling out from whatever rock you've been hiding under. I'd like you to meet my husband, Marcus." Julian's smile faltered. His gaze flickered over Marcus's simple clothes, a flicker of dismissive contempt in his eyes. "Husband? Eleanor, I didn't realize you'd remarried. Or married at all." Marcus extended a hand, his grip firm and sure when Julian reluctantly took it. "We like to keep our private life private," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lily, silent as always, peeked out from behind his leg, her wide, curious eyes fixed on Eleanor. The 5 minutes stretched into an eternity of stilted conversation. Julian tried to needle, to find a crack in their story, but Marcus was an unmovable wall of quiet confidence. He answered questions with a simple, unadorned honesty that seemed to baffle Julian more than any intricate lie could have. Finally, defeated and visibly irritated, Julian excused himself. The moment he was gone, Eleanor sagged against Marcus, the adrenaline leaving her weak. "Thank you," she breathed, pulling her arm away. "I'm so sorry. That was unprofessional and completely out of line." "It's all right," Marcus said, his focus shifting back to his daughter, who was now holding up her stuffed bear as if offering it to Eleanor. He seemed like a man who needed to be put in his place. Eleanor looked down at the silent child. "Hello," she said softly. Lily didn't answer, just pushed the bear forward more insistently. "She doesn't talk much," Marcus explained gently, "but she wants you to hold Barnaby. He gives good hugs." Hesitantly, Eleanor took the worn teddy bear. It was warm from the little girl's hands. For the first time all night, she felt a flicker of genuine warmth herself. "Thank you, Lily," she whispered. The lie had been for her, but the first moment of truth in that cold, gilded room belonged to a silent child and her threadbare bear. A week later, Eleanor found herself standing outside. Marcus turned, a smile touching his lips when he saw her. "Miss Vance, I didn't expect to see you here." "Eleanor, please," she said, setting the basket down on a clear patch of workbench. It looked absurd amongst the clamps and wood shavings. "I wanted to thank you properly, and this is for Lily." She gestured to the basket, which was overflowing with imported chocolates and high-end toys. Marcus looked at the basket, then at Lily, who hadn't looked up from her drawing. "That's very generous of you, Eleanor, but a simple thank you would have been more than enough." His words weren't a rebuke, but they made her feel the chasm between their worlds. In her life, gratitude was transactional, expressed through expensive gestures. Here, it seemed to be a simpler, purer currency. "Well," Eleanor said, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "Still, I appreciate what you did." Lily suddenly got up and walked over, not to the basket but to Eleanor. She held out her sketchbook. On the page was a drawing of a queen with a sad face, standing in a tall glass tower. Next to the tower stood a man and a little girl holding a bear. Eleanor's breath hitched. The innocent, unfiltered truth of the drawing was more piercing than any analyst's report on her public image. "Is that me?" Lily nodded, then pointed to the sad face she had drawn. "She worries about you," Marcus said softly, coming to stand beside them. She said the queen looked lonely. Loneliness was Eleanor's oldest and most steadfast companion. She had built her empire as a fortress to keep the world out, but she had never considered that someone might see the prisoner inside. For the first time in a decade, she felt a crack in that fortress. She wanted to explain, to tell this kind man and his perceptive daughter why the queen was so lonely. She ended up staying for coffee, served in a chipped ceramic mug that felt more comforting in her hands than the crystal flutes from the gala. They sat at Lily's little table, Eleanor's designer suit a stark contrast to the rustic, functional space. "Julian," she began, the name tasting like ash. "The man from the gala. We were engaged, a long time ago. We were going to build a company together." Out and patted Eleanor's hand. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt like an absolution. Eleanor realized she had spent years constructing walls of steel and glass, when all she might have needed was the simple, sturdy warmth of wood. That first visit turned into a second, and then a third. Eleanor found herself making excuses to drive to the workshop. She'd bring coffee, or pastries she claimed were leftovers from a meeting, and she would sit and watch Marcus work. The precision and care he put into his craft were mesmerizing. He was creating something real and tangible, something that would bring warmth and function to a home. She, on the other hand, spent her days in abstract meetings, moving numbers around a screen, creating products that were obsolete in 18 months. One Saturday, she found him not in the workshop, but in the small community garden behind his apartment building. Lily was diligently watering a patch of struggling tomato plants. "I didn't take you for a gardener," Eleanor said, smiling. Marcus wiped a smear of dirt from his forehead. "It's more for Lily than for me. Her mom loved to garden. It helps her feel close to her." It was the first time he had mentioned Lily's mother. Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by a softer, more somber curiosity. She sat on the edge of the raised bed, careful not to soil her cream-colored trousers. What was she like? The story came out as gently as he tended the plants. His wife, Sarah, had been a vibrant, joyful artist. They had been high school sweethearts. 4 years ago, their car had been hit by a drunk driver. Sarah was killed instantly. Marcus had walked away with a broken arm, and Lily, strapped in her car seat, had been physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. She hadn't spoken a word since. "The doctors call it selective mutism," Marcus explained, his voice thick with a grief that was clearly still near the surface. "A trauma response. She speaks with her drawings and with Barnaby, and sometimes with her heart. I just have to be patient enough to listen." Eleanor looked at the little girl, who was now carefully tucking a blanket of mulch around the base of a plant. She saw not a broken child, but a resilient one, being nurtured by a father whose love was as patient and deep as the earth itself. Her own problems, a corporate betrayal. White marble with truckload of soil, planters, and seedlings. For the first time, Eleanor's home was filled with the scent of damp earth. Lily, in a pair of tiny overalls, immediately set about organizing the seed packets with a seriousness that made Eleanor laugh. Compartments they worked for hours under the spring sun, their hands in the dirt. Eleanor, the CEO who commanded armies of engineers, found a profound satisfaction in the simple, honest labor of planting a seed. Marcus taught her how to test the soil, how to give the roots enough room to grow. He spoke of the plants with a reverence she found captivating. As they worked, she learned more about him. He had given up a scholarship to study architecture to care for his ailing father. After his father passed, he'd started his own business, choosing the hands-on craft of woodworking over designing skyscrapers because he wanted to build things that people would live with and love. He had sacrificed ambition for integrity at every turn. Their easy camaraderie was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor was in her office, reviewing quarterly projections, when her assistant announced an unscheduled visitor. Julian Croft strode in, his presence sucking the air from the room. "A rooftop garden, Eleanor? How delightfully domestic," he began without preamble. "I had my sources check on your new handyman. A single father who makes custom furniture. You've really lowered your standards." "Get out, Julian," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Not so fast. I'm here to make you an offer. A final one. Vance Innovations is vulnerable. Your last launch underperformed. My company, Apex, is poised to swallow you whole. Sell me your controlling shares. I'll make you rich enough to retire and play in the dirt for the rest of your life. And if I refuse," his smile was a razor's edge, "then I will burn your reputation to the ground. I'll paint you as the vindictive ex-lover who stole my ideas. I'll bleed you dry in the courts and on the stock market. You'll lose everything. Again." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "And this time, you won't have a handsome carpenter to hide behind." Aborted, the threat hung in the air long after he left. Julian wasn't just attacking her company. He was attacking her new life, the fragile piece, raising the garden she had just begun to plant in her own soul. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if winning was worth the price. The crisis broke on a Friday morning. Just as Julian had promised, a major financial news outlet published a scathing article, an elegantly spun narrative that painted Eleanor as a corporate thief who had built her empire on a jilted lover's stolen genius. The story was filled with half-truths and twisted facts, but it was plausible enough to be devastating. The stock price for Vance Innovations plummeted. Her board called an emergency meeting. The boardroom was a pressure cooker of fear and anger. Men and women she had worked with for years looked at her with suspicion. "We need a counterattack," said one of her senior VPs. "Now. We dig up everything we have on Croft. We leak it. We go scorched earth." "He started this war, Eleanor," said another. "We have to finish it." They were echoing the thoughts that had been screaming in her own head. The desire for vengeance was a powerful, familiar drug. It had fueled her for a decade. She felt the cold, calculating part of her brain taking over, formulating a plan of attack that would be swift, brutal, and final. She knew Julian's weaknesses, his skeletons. She could ruin him. She spent the weekend locked in her sterile penthouse, the half-finished garden on her terrace mocking her. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was isolated again, the walls she had so carefully built closing in. She ignored Marcus's calls, ashamed to let him see her like this, consumed by the very darkness he had helped her escape. On Sunday night, she found a sketchbook propped against her door. Lily had somehow convinced the doorman to let her leave it. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single drawing. It showed the sad queen from the first drawing, but this time she wasn't in her glass tower. She was standing in a garden, holding a watering can, and she was smiling. The sun was shining. Beneath the drawing, in the wobbly, hesitant letters of a child just learning to write, were two words: "Let it grow." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, mingling with the rain on the window she leaned against. Lily wasn't just talking about the garden on the roof.
Good morning, everyone.
she began, her voice steady. "I know you are all expecting a strategy to counter the attacks from Mr. Croft and Apex. You are expecting me to fight fire with fire." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the anxious faces, finally landing on Julian. "But I will not." A murmur of disbelief went through the room. "For the past 10 years, she continued, I have run this company with a single-minded focus on profit and victory. I was driven by anger and a need to prove myself, and we became successful. But we also became hollow, like this building, all glass and steel without a soul." She clicked a button, and the large screen behind her lit up, not with financial projections, but with a simple, damning document. The original copyright filing for the code Julian had stolen from her all those years ago, time-stamped, with her digital signature. "The truth is, Mr. Croft built his company on a lie. He stole my work to launch his career. That is a fact." Julian's face went pale. "And for years, I have wanted nothing more than to expose that fact, to watch him burn. Using that anger would be the easy thing to do. It would probably even work. But it would perpetuate the same toxic, ruthless culture that I am no longer willing to lead." The room was utterly silent. This wasn't a corporate presentation, it was a confession. It was a reckoning. "The truth I want to talk about today is not about the past. It's about the future. I am done building things out of spite. I want to build things with purpose." She looked directly at her board. "Effective immediately, I am restructuring Vance Innovations. We will be implementing a new charter focused on ethical technology and employee profit sharing. And I will be placing my entire controlling interest in the company into a perpetual trust, managed by and for the employees of this company. I will be stepping down as CEO." Gasps echoed through the room. Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. He had come for a war and found himself in a church. What will you do?" her senior VP asked, his voice filled with awe. Eleanor smiled, a real, radiant smile. "I'm going to learn how to garden." She turned and walked by the dome of fabric. "I heard," he said simply. "It was on the news feed. Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm free." A small hand tugged on her coat. She looked down to see Lily, bundled in a bright yellow raincoat, looking up at her. The little girl's eyes were shining with a light that rivaled the city's skyline. Then, for the first time in 4 years, Lily spoke, her voice as clear and bright as a bell after a storm. "You have sunshine in your eyes, Ellie." Eleanor knelt, disregarding her expensive suit on the wet pavement, and wrapped the little girl in a fierce hug. The rain fell around them, but under the umbrella, held by the steady hand of the man she was falling in love with, Eleanor Vance was finally, truly warm. 1 year later, the rooftop garden was an explosion of life. Rows of ripe tomatoes strained against their vines. Bees buzzed lazily around fragrant lavender bushes, and a riot of sunflowers turned their faces towards the sun. The sterile concrete terrace had become a vibrant, living sanctuary high above the city. Eleanor, dressed in jeans and a simple t-shirt, knelt in the soil, her hands dirty. A simple gold band glinted on her left hand, a perfect match to the one on Marcus's. He was nearby, sanding a small, custom-built planter box, the familiar, comforting scrape of his tools a constant soundtrack to their new life. She was no longer a CEO. She now ran the Vance Foundation, the charitable arm of her former company, which was thriving under its new employee-led model. She spent her days funding inner-city gardens, tech education programs for underprivileged youth, and art therapy centers. She was building things that grew. "Mom?" a cheerful voice called out. "Barnaby wants to know if the carrots are ready yet." Lily, her pigtails bouncing, ran across the terrace, her laughter echoing in the open air. Her silence was a distant memory, replaced by an endless stream of questions, stories, and songs. She chattered on about her day at school, about the new bird she'd seen, about Barnaby's very important culinary opinions. Eleanor smiled, her heart full to bursting. She looked from her chattering,